Um, so this paper arises out of a project that I have been working on for quite some time about on the subject of language acquisition and cognitive development. In fact, I wrote a version of this particular part a few years back at an ICA conference that had the theme communication across the lifespan. Because what is more central to communication across our lifespan than memory? What is communication across our lifespan if not memory? And in what ways does memory communicate across our life, and to what ends? Well, let me pose from this two simple and related questions. The first of these questions is, what is your earliest memory? And the second is, how old were you at the time of that which you remember? I ask you to think for a moment about the answer to these two questions, and in asking you to do so, I'm not asking you to think of something that is part of your family lore or stories told around the holiday table. I'm not asking about something others may have told you about a moment from your childhood. I am asking you to try to fixate upon and call forth your own memory. I'm asking you to try to determine the very first event or experience that you established, or which established itself in your mind without the assistance of others. I'm asking you to wind your way back through the inventory of the earliest days of your conscious existence to that very moment in which our uniquely human consciousness takes form. The moment we first take in information through our senses and suddenly have the means to hold it in mind and carry it with us for all of our time on the planet up to the present moment. It is, after all, that part of our life that we can remember and reflect upon, and our ability to remember and reflect, that truly defines our conscious existence, consciousness of the self and consciousness of the self in relation to our sensory experience and to others. A conscious life for human beings is a reflective life. Thus, what we consider human consciousness does not begin from the moment of our birth. It doesn't begin with sensation, sensory awareness, and perception. It begins, rather, at that moment when our brain's development allows for memory to take flight. Memory as a means of reflection and remembrance as a form of reflection constitute the beginning, the arrival of the mind. Now, in asking you about your memory, I'm also not simply asking about the memory itself. I'm trying to spur, or asking you to spur, the mechanism of memory, the mechanism that magically allows us to call forth in our mind over and again this and any piece of our past, with all of the associations that might be attached to it, and with its accompanying mental image, or perhaps I ought to say a mental video. I use the word magically because the word seems appropriate in light of the following additional questions. Exactly what and where is this memory prior to the instant you call it forth? And how do you call it forth? How does memory work as a function of the human brain? Now, with respect to the brain science that offers the answer to those questions, I will say three things. First, I am not a neuroscientist. It's not my field of expertise. Second, I have a number of colleagues and friends within the discipline of media ecology and media studies who do carry out research on the subject of media, the brain, and neuroscience. And third, I have a very close friend who is a physician, with dual certification in neurology and psychology. And as he said it to me, what neuroscientists know about the human brain and how it works would fit in the palm of my hand, measured against the size of this room. This said, let's get back to those original two questions about your earliest memory. Here are a few prompts to assist you. The first is that the recognition that such memory is first and foremost visually based, right? It comes as or with a clear mental picture, or as I suggested above, a little movie of the mind. My second prompt is to tell you that most people's answer to these questions indicate that their first memory dates to sometime during their fourth year of life or their third year of age. Of course, I'll admit, I haven't posed these questions to a statistically valid sample of people or to a sample of people across cultures. I've mostly asked them of graduate students and undergraduate students in my courses about children and media. during our discussions about cognitive development. I also bring them up for fun once in a while with family and friends. But from this relatively small, convenient sample over the years, I've discovered that most people's earliest memories seem to fall within the same narrow age range. Yes, once in a while, someone will insist that his or her memory goes back to the age of 2. Now and then, a student will tell me that he or she cannot remember anything before the age of 4 or even 5. In both of these instances, I press the case. Is this really true? And if so, how might we account for such variation? Suffice to say this: memory, and thus our uniquely human consciousness, does arise at a relatively common point in the development of the brain. How and why this is so became something of an inspiration behind my larger project, because thinking about memory and consciousness led me to examine what it is that suddenly triggers our ability to remember. This function of, and at first, this autonomic habit of the mind. It led me to consider memory from this point in cognitive development, how memory develops, how we strengthen, supplement, and extend it for the reasons we are compelled to do so. And this paper, of course, is then an examination of the ways in which memory is mediated, how we mediate it, and why we mediate it. I will point out that memory is at first autonomic for 2 reasons. One is to remind you that you did not, tell your brain to have your first memory. It just happened. My first memory, as far as I can tell, came during a summer vacation 1 month after my 3rd birthday, as I walked with my aunt across a small bridge in Manasquan, New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, and I peered into a fisherman's bucket of fish. This moment is otherwise of no consequence in my life. There's no reason for me to remember it. I just do. My second point about autonomic or first memory is that this then continues. We do not take deliberate action to commit to memory everything we remember. In fact, to be accurate with language here, we should use the passive voice and say that events and experiences are often committed to memory rather than something we deliberately and consciously register and deposit into our memory banks. What happens later is that we eventually teach ourselves and learn to remember things, to instruct our minds to do so. I can vividly recall another memory exercise from my childhood. While walking to school with a friend one morning, I decided to perform a little experiment. I decided at a particular moment to try to remember that moment, a moment of no significance whatsoever beyond my willful attempt to create the memory. There's nothing out of the ordinary happening, yet to this day I remember exactly where I was when it occurred to me to perform my experiment. I can still see in my mind's eye the building we were walking past. It was the June Myers Dance School. I remember the weather, that it was a lovely sunny morning. Thus, the power of deliberate, determined, and forced remembrance is the other, later, and more advanced side of the memory coin. Well, in the interest of time, and so that I can get to memory and mediation, let me compress the remainder of this discussion about memory, remembrance, and the brain and mind by saying that understanding memory is a matter of understanding both the lower primitive brain and the central nervous system and the evolution of our higher evolved brain. It is a matter of understanding the role of memory in our survival as animals and as a species, and its role in how we ended up as the species with dominion over life on the planet. It is a matter of understanding the workings of both short-term and long-term memory. Now, what is important to my task here is that the development of the brain's ability to remember arrives concomitantly with the onset of yet another function of mind, the early stages of our acquisition of language. My purpose in pointing this out is to suggest 2 things. The first is that our acquisition of language influences and impacts memory, that our developing ability with language both provides us with a secondary means to help us hold on to things in our autonomic memory, but drives the ability that is deliberate, determined, and forced memory, or what I will call from here, verbal memory. My second point is that what we learned in the transition from oral culture to a culture of alphabetic writing is that oral language is itself both memory-driven and memory dependent, that verbal memory in oral culture required great effort and therefore took up brain power, and that as the one other brain function that defines our human mind and uniquely human consciousness, our languaging ability changed memory from what it was before our species had language, and in effect changed our minds. The tradition of storytelling in oral culture represents the first time we externalize memory. And in effect, this is what the remainder of this paper is about, the relationship of and the difference between internal and external memory. Across human history, we have two types of stories we tell. Stories about ourselves and stories about our culture and its traditions. Thus, the practice of cultural storytelling in early oral cultures like ancient Greece is instructive because it is built upon poetic forms, wherein we rely upon the meter and rhyme scheme as mnemonic devices to hold the story in mind in an accurate way and pass it down over time with that same accuracy. This is an important component of the roots of verbal memory in a culture with only oral language, at the same time that it serves as a prime example of how oral language is itself memory dependent. If I have not yet said it clearly enough, language is the basis of second-order memory. It is the development of systems of writing, however, that externalizes memory in a much more obvious and tangible way, in a way that most people think about technology, because the tools with which we write and the media upon which we write create an artifact. Writing also in part reverses us back toward autonomic memory as a result of the fact that it creates a means of artificial memory. It externalizes memory in a way that allows us for the first time to free our minds from having to exert brain power and carry out the brain function that is verbal-based remembering. Oh, thank you. How could you tell? We no longer need to work to remember something. We can write it down and thereby capture it and come back to it later. And we know we can count on the fact that it will be there as originally recorded. Thus, while oral language is itself an invention and creates two forms of technologized verbal memory, internal and external, writing is the first invention we tend to think of as technologizing or mediating memory. It is also the invention we think of as creating a quantum shift in externalized memory by helping us to free up mental energy in order that our minds might carry out other business. Of course, it's one thing to say that writing achieves this. It is another thing entirely to speak about the democratization of literacy, about a critical mass of literate peoples who can write down their own memories and read, and who also have an interest and even a need to read the memories written down by others. This comes about gradually during the age of print culture. However, the development of print also brought about the commodification of our formerly written form of human communication. As a result, certain peoples telling their stories as memory in autobiography, or the stories of others as biography, or the telling of our cultural history and traditions as non-fictional work, and with the rise of literature and the novel conjuring up stories that are pure products of the creative imagination, all this ends up providing us with a privileged form of memory. We end up with externalized memories that are widely known and recognized and read by many, and then barriers to entry for the rest of us. Thus, print literate culture and the rise of mass communication create, in effect, a hierarchy of externalized memory and a validating process that values some works or products of memory over others. The next step, I'm not looking at my time cues, I'm almost done. The next step in this evolution that I'm trying to trace does not exactly or neatly follow the evolution of our media of communication into its next iteration, which is the revolution that is electronic mass communication. It is more exactly the consequence of a particular product of this stage of the image and the moving image. This history begins with the commissioned secular portraiture and painting of members of royalty, of the nobility, of the wealthy merchant class during the Renaissance. In the early 19th century, though, we then have the invention of photography, which changes things completely, in that we can now have grandma's actual likeness captured in a moment in time. I, by the way, could argue that the capturing of the sound of grandma's voice in a recording is of similar, if not equal importance as memory, but it seems that we have never developed a cultural practice of capturing the sound of people's voices to the extent that photography became our go-to vehicle for fixating memories of someone. In fact, given the relatively recent development of the moving image as video, I'm often surprised that I've yet to come across research that examines the significance of the difference between the silent filmed home movies of the mid-20th century and the addition of sound in the home videos that people now shoot. My point, however, is this. In following from Walter Ong's concept of secondary orality, the image and moving image become the form now by which we externalize autonomic memory. Film and video as moving image become primary in this regard, as they are the exact external concomitant of our mental images. In fact, we cannot point to the two-dimensionality of film and video screens as a difference because our mental images themselves have no semblance of three-dimensionality. As a result, in an age in which we have both print or text and moving image-based media, we have externally mediated forms of both orders of internal memory, autonomic and verbal. So where does this lead us in the present moment, in an age of the internet and social and mobile media? With respect to the rise of social media in all its forms, blogs, microblogs, vlogs, Facebook, Twitter, Insta, TikTok, and all the rest of our new social media product lines, our children and our students are every day discovering and using, what they are every day discovering and using. What we've done is to explode and democratize the possibilities by which we communicate our internal memory as external memory. To what ends? Well, those of us who are of a certain age can remember going to visit certain family or friends who would at some point in the evening break out the photo album or albums. Some of the time, we as guests would be the ones to initiate this by making the request. Most of the time, though, it was the host who wished to show off photographs of his or her latest vacation or the baby's first steps. And we as guests, we politely tolerated this custom, even when we considered it a kind of an awkward imposition, kind of a Kafkaesque social moment. Some of us, on the other hand, not only tolerated it, but welcomed it, sometimes depending upon, who the people were and what the photos were, and sometimes, perhaps less often, because we were honestly interested in these representations of folks' memories. In an age of social media, this kind of practice has expanded exponentially. I am, of course, not just talking about people posting photographs of their latest vacation, which you look at while you're at home procrastinating the work you're supposed to be doing, or the meal that they're having at a restaurant, or their cat, or, and sometimes without editing, right? Without any mind to composition or parsimony. I'm talking about the extent to which we are all on the internet, producers of media in a way that speaks to our need for our lives and the story of our lives to be recognized and held in esteem and have meaning regardless of whether on the consumption side anyone is paying attention or cares. Hitting that like button is, after all, expending the least conceivable amount of effort to show that we care and are interested. Social media thus become the latest mechanism by which we externalize and communicate, by which we mediate our memories, autonomic and verbal, in ways and to extents that speak to our idiosyncrasies and our personality traits, right? Extroversion, egoism, narcissism, and within a realm where to exist is to post. And to not post means you are not there, that you have nothing to say or show for yourself. Add to this the mobile internet of our smartphones, and memories are posted as they are in the making. As such, we have possibly brought about for autonomic memory a strange sort of concomitant to the way in which writing serves as a form of artificial memory for our verbal memories. That is to say, it is now the capturing and posting of the memory, simultaneous with the experience, that matters, to the detriment of having the experience, of being in the moment. Now, note that this is quite different from the act of writing down thoughts and ideas, as our internal conversation with ourselves is indeed a form of experience, but it is rather removed and solipsistic as opposed to our being in and moving through the world. Finally, to the extent that everyone is mediating their memories, the question of for what and whom we are producing all of these memories becomes the most important question of our time. If that is, we're really and mainly doing so to provide Silicon Valley's best and brightest with free content that brings them revenue that they use to sell advertising back to us and free data that they can sell to one another. But in the end, what I'm most captivated about by mediated memory in our digital world is this: that in contradistinction to the hierarchy of mediated memory in a culture of mass communication, in digital culture, the memories of us all are equal and flat. And with every passing day, we compile more and more of these memories as big data, too big to wrap our minds around, as zeros and ones, the pulse and no pulse of computer memory contained in server farms that will continue to build and expand as containers for as long as we try to keep them. And to what ends? Thanks.